Okay, folks, we're in the home straight of the India Summit 2015, and this is the final session of the day. Cultural exchange. I think it's fair to say that the UK and India share a cultural bond that's been celebrated in art, literature, film, music, and of course, cuisine. Chicken tikka masala is the #1 dish in the UK. But where next for the British-India cultural relationship? We're going to try and find out today. As you can see, we are very lucky this afternoon to have with us a good friend of +91 and one of the most respected writers and broadcasters on business, sports, culture, and of course, India. Mihir Bose has broadcast for the BBC and Sky and written for most of the heavyweight UK newspapers, including the FT, the Sunday Times, the Telegraph, and currently the London Evening Standard. I think Mihir's journalism is quite unique in the sense that it doesn't just report events, but I think it provides a very shrewd analysis of situations. And it's no surprise that he's won many prestigious awards. And I think it's worth pointing out that many of the awards that Mihir has won have been voted on by other journalists themselves. So if you like, Mihir Bose is the journalist's journalist. So tell us more about his forthcoming book on India, with a very interesting title, From Midnight to Glorious Morning, ? And also to share his thoughts on the British-India cultural relationship, let's give a very warm +91 welcome back to the great Mihir Bose.
Thank you, Rakesh. My wife is in PR. She could take some lessons from you on how to promote clients. I'll play that tape to her. Well, after that, what can one say? Anything would be a disappointment. But I'll tell you what, I'll start with an anecdote in an Indian railway carriage, an overnight train to Ahmedabad. I wouldn't recommend it, but never mind. This is part of the book that Rakesh mentioned, which is shortly to come out. I wanted to go to Dundee, which is, of course, where a 63-year-old half-naked fakir wearing a loincloth went to make salt in order to illustrate the iniquities of British rule. And while I was there, on this overnight train to Ahmedabad, because he went from Sabarmati to Dundee all those years ago, I was a young Indian I met, so I thought I'd ask him about Gandhi. He was reading a book of Aristotle, so I thought, he's probably interested in famous figures, but he was actually interested in talking about David Cameron, now, who you wouldn't put in the same category immediately. I mean, he might well become greater than Aristotle, and no, I can't see him ever wearing a loincloth, but never mind. What had happened was just then, David Cameron had visited India. Not only had he visited India, but he had had street food in Calcutta. And he had addressed Indian students, and this young Indian said he knew about Gandhi, of course, but he knew nothing about Dundee or making salt and so on, And he said how impressed he was with David Cameron, and how at that conference, or that sort of seminar, talking to young Indians, he talked about education, and he said, no Indian politician would behave like that. And of course, no Indian politician would have street food and avoid Delhi belly or Calcutta belly or whatever it is that, So Cameron must have, apart from anything else, a wonderful stomach. But nevertheless, I narrate this because David Cameron is doing something that is unique in British-India relationship. He has visited India 5 times, which is a record. He has visited India 3 times as Prime Minister. Now, why is it a record? Rakesh said India-British connections. There are whole sorts of myths about India-British connections. The India-British connections goes back 350 years. During that time, and nearly 200 years, the British ruled India. They didn't actually rule all of India. That's another myth. A third of India was never ruled by the British. They were ruled by the princes, who were quite independent. As long as they didn't want to marry British women and didn't have external relationship with anybody else, they were allowed to do what they liked, and most of them did. But nevertheless, and no British Prime Minister ever visited India. No British major literary figure, apart from Kipling and E.M. Foster, ever went to India. In fact, the British had, in 1931, the British had just over 300,000 people in India, a population of 353 million. Very few British went to India. In fact, those statistics impressed 2 people, very well-known figure, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. In fact, Adolf Hitler, as the before Operation Barbarossa, told his SS officers, look at the British. His favorite film was The Bengal Lancer, incidentally. And he said, look at the British. Look how a small group of white people rule this whole dominion, and you must be like that. Well, we all know what Adolf Hitler did. But anyway, the point about this is there's been a myth. I don't know if you've seen Indian Summers recently. This film set in this drama set in Shimla in the 1930s. And I was at the press conference launching it, and Julie Walters, a wonderful actress, was there, and she made a big plea that this drama is going to reconnect us with India, with the India we have forgotten. Well, the British people never knew, so there's nothing to forget. It was a bit of imagining. There was a rule in the days of the Raj that no British child of 7 could stay in India, because after that, they would go either mad or, so fall in and all that sort of stuff. And what is happening now? Why is that important? It's happening because now the British are discovering India in the way they never did India. Even when I was growing up in India, to give you a cricketing example, we loved Australian cricketers. Why did we love Australian cricketers? And this at a time when Australia had a white Australia policy, where no Indian could go to Australia. We didn't know about that. We didn't care. Why? Because the Australians were very clever, and we might see more of their cleverness in a few weeks' time. But not only on the cricket field, they were also quite clever off it. What they used to do on the way back from the Ashes series, they used to go by ship, they used to stop off in India, and their best team would play, absolutely thrash the Indians. The Indians didn't mind that. They wanted to win, but they were not a good enough team in those days. But they saw all the great Australian cricketers, apart from Donald Bradman, who never stepped foot in India, because I think he was worried about getting whatever it was, Delhi belly or Bombay belly. Everyone played. Whereas the British, unique record in cricket, the first English captain to take a team to India in 1950 was a man called Nigel Howard, whose distinction is that he only ever played in India 4 times, both as cricketer and captain. In fact, his first test was also the first time he played for England. He never played again. This is a complete unique record in cricket. I mention all this because it's very important to realize where we are coming from and why tikka masala and all that is so important. And of course, India is now, in the English imagination, is important. The other day I was going to a Portsmouth University where there was a talk about Sachin Tendulkar. Some of you may have heard of him. I won't here have a poll about whether Sachin Tendulkar is the greatest cricketer or not. I would expect in this, Rakesh, to hear that, though I know some Australians, which is why one doesn't like the Australians, think Brian Lara is a better cricketer. Well, there you are. What can you do with the Australians? But the point is that I was in this train talking to a lady next to me, wondering whether I'd been there in time for this conference. And she had heard of Sachin Tendulkar. Now, it's quite remarkable. Back in the 30s, there were 2 Indians well known here. Ranjit Singh Ji, the cricketer, and a man called the Aga Khan. He was very well known. In fact, he was so well known that chocolates used to be advertised on London buses called as rich and dark as the Aga Khan. Today it would run into trouble. It would run into trouble in the Race Relations Act. But he was actually a great the spiritual leader of the Ismailis and a great horse owner and all that sort of stuff. Now, where then, and also now, what is happening with British-India relationship? Apart from what may be called the cultural side, there's a very interesting thing going on at the moment. As we all know, there is a lot of commemoration of the First and the Second World Wars. And the way it's being commemorated in this country is very interesting. It's being presented as a fight for freedom. It was a fight for freedom. It was a fight for freedom for the Europeans, not for the non-whites. The non-whites were not meant to be free. The First World War made that very, very clear. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, a southern United States president, even refused to accept a Japanese proposal for anti-racist laws of the League of Nations. And Winston Churchill, when this Atlantic Charter was promulgated, which said freedom to all, said it didn't apply to India. It didn't apply to any of the British colonies. And yet, what you observe, of course, in these celebrations, commemorations, call it what you will, there were Indians who fought. So, it's a curious thing. You fought for freedom and you were not free yourself. But it is, at the moment, and this is it's an encouraging sign that the Indians have the confidence where they can celebrate it as something they did. Because in the First World War, of course, no Indian officers were allowed. It only came after the Second World War. Well, let me tell you a personal story about this. Next week, my wife, who's English, is going to the First World War battlefields. And because her relations in the First World War died, and, she's rightly going there to honor. And we've been there before. And anyway, I couldn't go. There's events like, I know it sounds trivial, but there are events like the Ashes and Wimbledon on and things like that. But apart from that, I felt that there are no ancestors of mine there. There couldn't be, because the British, when they recruited for the army, they had a martial race theory, and we Bengalis were not allowed to be, we were not supposed to be fighters. In fact, the one British writer famously said, if you look at the legs of a Bengali, you'll see the legs of a slave. If you want to see my legs later on, I can give you a special session, but I hope you won't ask for that. Anyway, now, but there's another factor here in how, Rakesh said, how is British-India relationship going to develop? And this is influenced, going to be hugely influenced by the diasporas. Now, what is the Indian diaspora here? There are three kinds of diasporas, three Indian diasporas. The first diaspora, and I don't wish to be condescending, are the people who came mainly from the Punjab after 1950. Most of them were of an agricultural background, from the villages and so on. That is, after India became independent, became a republic, Nehru violated Congress policy and kept India in this unique form of Commonwealth, where the Queen is the head of the Commonwealth Club. You know, it's nice dining club, which the Queen quite likes. They meet every 2 years or so. I don't know, they probably have tikka masala, though I'm not sure whether the Queen has ever had tikka masala. And that was the first lot. Then the second lot, which completely transformed the diaspora in this country, was the East African nations, who were second or third generation Indians, and they came as business people, and they are the one who changed the face of the Asian community here. When I came in '69, Spike Milligan used to brown up as an Indian and have a sitcom on ITV. I mean, you're probably too young to remember. In those days, there was only 3 channels. So, most of you look so young, you wouldn't remember that. One of them was a sitcom where he played a waiter in which he ever said 3 words, goodness gracious me. Is it 3 or 4, or whatever it is? And if you remember now, this is the transformation in India. There was a sitcom of Meera Syal where the title was Goodness Gracious Me, which shows the confidence of the community that it can laugh at itself. And there's a third strain of the community that's come. I say strain, it's probably represented. I know there's a Mr. Agarwal here who represents that strain, though he tells me he's not as rich as Lakshmi Mittal. But, that's the strain of, the people who've come from India, who've profited from the economic development that has taken place. Now, why this matters is because there's another diaspora, which is a bigger one and a more powerful one, and is having a bigger influence, and that is the American diaspora, the Indian diaspora in America. That's a totally different diaspora, because that diaspora is largely middle-class Indians who went. And people forget, we talk about America, the land of immigration, give me your poor huddled masses. But actually, for most of its existence, America didn't only wanted poor huddled masses from Northern Europe and Ireland. It didn't want the rest of the world. They had an Immigration Act of 1924, which particularly excluded Asians. And in 1960, there were no Asians allowed, apart from some Chinese. In 1960, only 2,000 Indians were in America. Then Kennedy said, I'm going to remove that legislation. The legislation was finally removed in 1965 by Lyndon Johnson, a historic year for America, which is also when the Civil Rights Act came in, and the Americans recognized that their own black citizens in the South were allowed to vote. And since then, 19 million Indians have gone. And they've gone from not the villages of India, not from East Africa. They've gone from India, fairly well-off Indians, educated. And these are the Indians who are having a tremendous impact back in India. Some of them have gone back to India. Some of them have molded. One of them, Atul Gawande, gave the wreath lecture, things like that. And in a certain sense, and with respect to Mr. Agarwal and Mr. Mittal, who are probably much richer than the Indians in America, they are having, in that sense, greater influence in what is happening in India. And why does that matter? It matters because what is a striking thing, I know you heard about Mr. Modi, my Lance Price, a wonderful journalist, an old colleague from the BBC, but what is the most distinct thing about Modi since he became Prime Minister? He hasn't been to this country. He hasn't been to London. The idea that India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, wouldn't come to London, well, there was Edwina Mountbatten, of course, but, we shan't go into that. As far as we know, Modi doesn't have an Edwina in London or anywhere else in Britain. Maybe that is a great secret that we will discover when he comes to London eventually. Who knows? I don't know about Modi's private life, and I'm not particularly interested. But the point is that Modi hasn't come, but he's gone to America. He addressed a huge gathering in Times Square of the Americans, and he has gone to East Asia. And these are the two facts of Indian foreign policy, which he wants to correct, because India has a curious relationship with America. It's summed up in a great Indian broadcaster who owns a TV station called NDTV, Pranay Roy, and he said, "America, leave us and take us with you." Years ago, when the Khalistan rebellion was on, there was a joke going the rounds which went like this. And of course, that was the Sikh movement. The first Sikh tells the second one, "You know, the moment we get the Khalistan state, we will declare war on America." And the second Sikh tells him, "Are you mad? America is the greatest power on earth. They'll destroy us." He said, "Yes, they'll destroy us, but like Japan and Germany, they will rebuild us and we'll become the most powerful country in the world." So, you know, that, if you like, that is going to be a big factor. I cannot see, and much as I love living in this country and I'm very fond of this country, I cannot see the British and the Indians having that same sort of relationship. Why? Because there are certain factors. One of them is, while the British are learning about India, to a certain extent, they can't forget their past. So there's a whole stream of British writers who I feel are always buttonholing, not me personally, but people like me, to say, "Listen, didn't we do well when we were in India? You know, were we not good?" And I say, "Yes, you were good. You were very good for yourselves." And, you know, and I, you know, that sort of, you know, if you like, the memories of the Raj to a certain extent, in as much as it exists, is still there. You know, we were not bad. And in fact, one must say this, if you're going to have a Premier League of empire builders and people who run the empire, the British would win the title every year. You wouldn't have had to have a contest. But that's a different matter from saying it's much better to be ruled by somebody else than be ruled by yourself. That's a totally different concept. And secondly, what I think there is, of course, also, I must say, an Indian chippiness, if you like, a certain Indian, you may have observed, I don't know, about 2 or 3 months ago, there was a film made by a British producer about the rape, the awful rape that took place in Delhi, which was banned by the Indians. I saw the film, it was very touching and very moving, and there was no reason to ban it. Of course, one of my own books have been banned in India, a book on the Aga Khan, not because of the chocolate business, but because of something else. But Indians can be sensitive, except in a way India's moved on a bit, because in the 1970s, when Louis Malle made a film about India, not only was the film banned, but the BBC was banned. So at this time, the Indians didn't, you know, if you like, Indians are progressing. But, you know, there is a certain touchiness. And I remember about a few years ago, when the Indian president came on her first visit to this country, first visit by an Indian president for about 20 years, some of us, I was considered an important Indian, was invited to Buckingham Palace. There was a show of Bollywood, and the Duke of Edinburgh came along, and he met somebody, and he asked him, "What's your name?" "Patel," said, and the Duke said, there are a lot of your relations here. And, you know, the Duke makes such remarks. And the poor chap was totally confused. Afterwards, he came to me, he said, "What does he mean? Does he mean there are a lot of Patels here?" And then he lowered his voice, said, "Does he mean there are a lot of Wogs here?" And, you know, but, you know, there is that sort of, and I think the reason for that is, and this is a fact that the British and the Indians must accept, that as opposed to its other colonies, its first great colony, America, and Ireland, the British and the Indians don't have great family ties. You know, that was not the nature of the relationship. Indians were a different race. The British didn't mix. In some early years of the rule, there was a bit of intermarriage. But basically, I mean, for instance, take Downton Abbey, a great television serial. Now, the master of Downton is married to an American woman. You know, one can understand you want to sell this serial to America. But imagine if the master of Downton was to be shown to be married to an Indian woman. You know, it would be a totally different thing. It would raise all sorts of questions, which would take it completely out of that whole scenario that's being set up. So what I would say is that what we are going to get, and I hope we'll get, is that Indians and the British will be very intimate guests, not members of the family. It would not be the same relationship as the British have with America or with Ireland. Most members of the, you know, this is why even at the height of the problem, height of Ireland's conflict with this country, as one writer said, the British could never divorce themselves from Ireland because members of their family are related to Ireland. And of course, what has happened, and this is very interesting, is that we have moved back almost exactly to February 1583. Now you may say, what am I talking about? Well, let me remind you what happened in February 1583. In February 1583, Elizabeth I, the first Elizabeth, entrusted to John Newbery, one of the first Englishmen to visit India, what amounted to a begging letter to Akbar, the Mughal emperor, calling him the most invincible and mighty prince. Invincible emperor, the English queen spoke of his humanity, saying she would be beholden if he looked after her subjects. As it happens, Elizabeth misspelled Akbar's name, called him the king of Cambodia, which was which was what India was called then. And by the time she actually wrote the letter, Akbar was dead. Jahangir was on the throne. Anyway, but in the days before Twitter, one would understand, because Akbar's death was not announced on Twitter, as far as I know. Might have been, but then historians have missed that. That is perfectly understandable. Then Elizabeth I was presiding over a state under great pressure. Her father had divorced the kingdom from Rome. Spain and Portugal were the dominant European powers, the start of the European domination of the world, and she was worried about where her kingdom was going and wanting to trade. And now, if you see, and at that time, what was India's position? Well, Akbar's great-grandson, who reigned from Aurangzeb, who reigned from 1659 to 1701, had $450 million in his treasury, 10 times more than his contemporary Louis XIV, and in today's figures, that would be $37.5 billion. Enough to, I think, see Greece out. But, whether Aurangzeb would have given that money to Greece, I don't know. He probably would have imposed much more penalties than Angela Merkel is going to do. And even in 1750, 5 years before Clive's victory at Plassey, India had 24.5% of world trade, second only to China with 32.8%, while UK had 1.9%. Now, 4 centuries later, what we are seeing now is that whole process reversed. Cameron goes there, not to say we once ruled you and civilized you and gave you democracy. These are not words they use. Now, if you see British ministers go to these wonderful functions that people like Mr. Agarwal and Mr. Mittal hold, in the great lavish hotels of London, they go, some of them, I have seen Theresa May wear a salwar kameez. I would not recommend her that she should wear that while she's campaigning because it might lose her some votes, but I've seen her speak passionately about India, the shared history and all this sort of thing, talk how wonderful it is that Gandhi's statue is next to Churchill in Parliament Square and all that, and the tone has changed, and Britain is now looking for trade. And of course, India is also interested in trade, but India, if Modi's directions is any guide, for India now, the United States, and then East Asia will be much more important than Britain. Britain will not be unimportant, but the scale of things will be quite different. Thank you.